100 rockets from Hezbollah were crossing the sky. People were talking about possible mining in the Strait of Hormuz. And in the middle of all of that, Washington was still pretending the real question was whether Iran had been weakened enough to accept an off-ramp. That is not the real question anymore. The real question is whether the United States has any exit left that does not make the final settlement look worse than the war's opening promise. That is the danger inside this moment, because the source text behind this rewrite is not really about missile counts. It is not even mainly about whether Iran still has enough launchers. Those are important details, but they are not the core of the story. The core of the story is that this war may already have crossed into the settlement phase. And once a war enters the settlement phase, every military option has to be judged not just by what it destroys today, but by the order it creates tomorrow. That is where things start to look grim for Washington. I want to use a framework for this version. I call it the off-ramp trap. The off-ramp trap is what happens when every path out of a war is politically humiliating, strategically costly, or militarily reckless. But staying in the war keeps making the eventual settlement even worse. That is exactly what this interview is describing. Start with the most obvious path, seek a way out. At first glance, that sounds like the sensible option: stop the escalation, claim the nuclear infrastructure was damaged, claim Iranian capabilities were reduced, say the enemy paid a price, say deterrence was restored, get out before a wider regional chain reaction makes everything harder. But the source is telling you why even that path is not clean. If Iran has absorbed this much damage, refused to bow, and continues to signal that it will not accept the old status quo, then an American off-ramp would not look like the restoration of order. It would look like an implicit admission that the maximal objective could not be achieved. And if the terms that follow include some version of America out of the Gulf, or an end to the old regional posture that allowed pressure to be staged indefinitely against Iran, then the war ends not with Washington writing the order, but with Washington adjusting to one it could not prevent. That is the first jaw of the trap. The second path is to keep escalating from the air and the sea while hoping Iran eventually folds. This is the path of inertia. It is attractive because it avoids the political shock of a ground war and avoids the embarrassment of an obvious retreat. It lets leaders say pressure is still building and the enemy is still degrading. It sounds tough. It sounds manageable. It sounds like the middle ground. The source tears this illusion apart. Its argument is simple: air and naval power can punish. But by themselves, they do not create enduring strategic outcomes against a country like Iran. They destroy facilities, kill people, create headlines, and maybe narrow the enemy's room for maneuver. But if the enemy's political will remains intact, if its social endurance remains intact enough, and if its escalation capacity still includes the ability to damage shipping, Gulf infrastructure, desalination plants, and the wider energy system, then the continuation of air and naval punishment does not solve the war. It extends the war while making the eventual terms harsher. That is not strategy. That is time working against you. Then comes the third path: boots on the ground. This is where the interview becomes brutally clear. The answer is no, absolutely not. And not in the theatrical way people say no online, in a much more damaging way. No, because the United States no longer has the right type of force, the right scale of force, or the right operating environment for that kind of campaign. This matters because once the words ground invasion enter the discussion, many people automatically picture old American campaigns, the slow buildup, the giant stockpile of equipment, the methodical assembly of overwhelming force, the long logistics chain, the air cover overhead, the columns rolling forward. The source is saying that model belongs to another era. Why? Because persistent surveillance changes the problem. Satellite intelligence, terrestrial collection systems, drones, precision missiles, and continuous observation mean the old style of buildup is now exposed much earlier and punished much harder. Choose a port, start unloading equipment, move in troops, build a corridor, and the enemy sees it. And if the enemy sees it, it can target it before your large campaign even properly begins. That means the real question is no longer, can America fight once the force is assembled? The real question is, can America assemble the force without suffering unacceptable damage before the war on land has even started? That is a much uglier question. Add to that the terrain, the distances, the drone environment, and the force structure problem. And the ground option stops looking like bold resolve and starts looking like a self-inflicted trapdoor. So the off-ramp trap tightens. If you leave, the political terms may be worse than Washington wants to admit. If you stay in the current mode, you deepen the damage without solving the strategic problem. If you escalate to the ground, you may walk into a form of warfare you are not prepared to sustain. And this is why the source keeps returning to the same deeper point. Iran is not behaving like a state preparing to accept the status quo. It is behaving like a state preparing to force a different one. That is what many people are still not understanding. When Professor Marandi is quoted saying Iran will not live with the status quo, that is not just rhetoric. It is a statement about the post-war settlement. It means Tehran is not simply trying to survive the bombing and then return to the old map, the old basing arrangement, the old assumptions, the old Gulf order. It wants the end of the war to produce a different strategic reality. And once that is your objective, holding back starts to look different. Holding back no longer means indecision. It means preserving leverage for the settlement phase. That is why the discussion of Karg Island matters so much. It is not only about oil, it is about thresholds. If Karg is hit, the source suggests Iran could answer with a much wider attack on Gulf oil infrastructure. Not because it wants chaos for its own sake, but because it would be signaling that if its own economic core is targeted, the entire regional energy architecture becomes fair game. The same is true of desalination plants. The source is explicit that strikes on such infrastructure are terrifying, not because they are symbolic, but because they move the war from military punishment to system disruption. In the Gulf, desalination is not a luxury, it is daily survival. Once that kind of infrastructure enters the cycle of attack and retaliation, the war is no longer just about deterrence. It becomes about whether whole societies can function normally. Anyone can see why the old optimistic reading is so dangerous. People hear that launch numbers are down and assume the war is moving toward closure. People hear talk of an off-ramp and a saving deal is available. People hear that Iran has suffered terrible damage and assume the remaining choices will naturally narrow into compliance. The source argues the opposite. It argues that we may be approaching some sort of arrangement. Yes, but not one Washington is going to like. Why? Because endurance changes bargaining power. If a country was expected to fold and does not fold, then every day it keeps functioning. Every strike it absorbs, every retaliatory option, it still preserves. Changes the political geometry of the endgame. That is why the line, war without strategy is war without end, is so important here. The problem is not only that the war is destructive, the problem is that the objectives were unattainable from the beginning. Regime change through decapitation strikes, political submission through shock, the hope of internal collapse under bombardment. The belief that enough damage would automatically produce the desired political end state. The source calls these assumptions what they are: stupid assumptions. And once a war is built on stupid assumptions, the settlement is almost always crueler than the opening speech promised. There's also a wider regional layer here that makes the trap even tighter. The source keeps pointing out that America has damaged not only Iran, but also states that are normally friendly to Washington. Europe is hit by energy stress. Asia is hit. Gulf states are watching missiles, radars, and military support flow primarily toward Israel, not toward them. Shipping is at risk. Markets are unstable. Currency volatility is wild. The old promise of American power in the Gulf was that it would preserve commerce if the lived result becomes disrupted commerce, exposed allies, and a settlement that likely reduces America's long-term military role anyway. Then the war has not defended the old order. It has accelerated the death of it, and that brings us to the hardest point in the whole piece. What if the off-ramp does not belong to Washington anymore? What if Washington can still choose the timing of some actions, but no longer controls the meaning of the outcome. That is the real fear here. Not simply battlefield failure. Something larger that America can still fire, still strike, still sanction, still posture, and yet the eventual settlement still moves towards something like this. America out, regional posture reduced, the strait managed under a broader international framework, Israel no longer able to assume permanent impunity, and Iran rewarded not because it won cleanly, but because it endured what was supposed to break it. That is a terrible political ending for the people who sold this war as a demonstration of strength, and it is why every next step now carries so much weight. Push for a bigger war, and you may trigger the very regional destruction that makes your final position even weaker. Try to freeze the war from above, and you may have to swallow terms that reveal how little leveraged shock power actually bought you. Pretend the status quo can be restored after all this. And you are lying to yourself. This is why I think the source is more alarming than it first appears. On the surface, it sounds like one more conversation about missiles, mines, the Gulf, Hezbollah desalination plants, and whether Iran is still dangerous underneath. It is a story about a power running out of good exits, and that is always when wars become most volatile. Not when one side is strongest, not when everyone is confident, not when the speeches are loudest, but when the options narrow into a set of choices where each one worsens the end state. That is the off-ramp trap. And if you want one sentence to hold on to from this whole story, it is this: the war is no longer being decided by how much damage each side has already done. It is being decided by which side can still shape the settlement without making the settlement worse. Right now, that is a much more uncomfortable question for Washington than many people are willing to admit. And that is why this moment is dangerous, because the scariest wars are not always the ones with the biggest explosions on a given day. Sometimes they are the ones where the explosions continue, the exits shrink, and the final deal keeps moving in the wrong direction. That is where this war seems to be heading. And that is why the most alarming possibility is not that Iran has no off-ramp. It is that America may be the one trapped without a good one.